Hello and welcome to everyone. I hoped I could speak with you without wearing glasses, if I dare say. Thank you. But with the light of the projectors, I must admit I am a bit dazzled by the light. Last week, we set out to begin to try to find some answers to the questions we are investigating this year, namely Confucius, who has, and still in many respects, has been revisited. Can he be resurrected? In other words, buried as he was and he still is under a heavy sedimentation of interpretations and instrumentalizations accumulated and stratified over more than 2,000 years. This poor Confucius, whom you can see on this slide, is there any chance for him to appear to us as being alive and thinking? This idea of a resurrection, which is a part of the title of my lecture this year, it is entitled Confucius Resurrected with a big question mark. This idea of a resurrection in the cultural content and the context that we're looking at certainly evokes the image of another famous person raised from the dead, namely Jesus Christ. I must quickly point out that without by any means launching into any theologic or religious discussion, or even any pseudo-interreligious dialogue, a bit like the Nishan Forum, located close to the alleged place of birth of Confucius, which we spoke about at our last lecture. So setting aside all of these debates, nevertheless, we must admit that we are surprised at certain analogies between Confucius and Jesus in the construction of a character, a legend, and also the construction of the textual sources associated to him. At our last lecture, we stopped at the first biographical between 8 quotation marks. That term biographical must be taken with a lot of precaution. So this first biography that claims to plot out in a chronological manner the life of Master Kong, whom we know of since the Jesuits stepped in under the name Confucius. Nevertheless, what strikes us straight away is that this biography is presented clearly as a hagiography rather than a biography. In other words, this biography in many respects is similar to the biography of the life of a saint. That's the meaning of the word hagiography, or at any rate, the story of the life of an extraordinary being in the very proper sense of the term, meaning a man who stands well above or beyond the destiny of ordinary people. So this first biography As we said at our last lecture, we find it in chapter 47. Chapter 47 of the Shiji. You can see the Chinese characters at the top of this slide. This title is translated into French by Edouard Chavannes, who chose to translate it as the historical records. Now, the CG is the monumental work of the historian considered as the very first true Chinese historian, Sima Qian. You have his name here, second on this list. And he is said to have lived from year 140 to 186 before the Christian era. So this chapter 47, very luckily for us, appears in the section of the historical records translated by Edouard Chavannes. Even luckier for us, on the internet, we can have access freely to this translation of chapter 47 in the French language, translated by one of the most eminent representatives of French sinology in modern times. That was Edouard Chavannes. I pointed out at our last lecture that he was a professor here at the Collège de France. The first tale of Confucius's life, as told by the Shiji, was apparently compiled at around the beginning of the Han Dynasty, which was officially founded in 206 before the Christian era. Now, the Shiji compilation is said to have been drafted at around 100 before the Christian era. In other words, 4 centuries after the lifetime of Confucius. And yet, despite the distance in time that could cast doubts as to the veracity of this biography, this is the biography that was used as the basis for almost all those until today who have followed the sort of continuous vulgate which has perpetuated itself. As for us, from chapter 47, we will only examine the points that are of interest to us for our purposes, consisting in seeing, first of all, to what extent the image of Confucius has passed on to us. This image, was it forged at the Han period, relatively late, therefore, as compared to the period when Confucius was alive, but precisely at a time when a new imperial order was being instituted. At the same time, we must try to see to what extent the Luyu, the Analects by Confucius, as a textual product. We must try to see, therefore, to what extent the Luyu is a part of the construction of this image of an imperial Confucius, one might say. This is something that we can ascertain more broadly speaking about several major figures in world spirituality. I am launching out into an attempt to draw a parallel with Jesus Christ, but you may also take other great figures of religious leaders or founders of spirituality around the world, and you will very often find this same process of institutionalization of a character who started apparently by striking the imagination of those who lived during his lifetime and subsequently was transformed, one might say, and to say things in a different terms, these characters who were recuperated by certain institutionalized or ideological forms. The question that we are trying to answer and that you must bear in mind throughout our study may be expressed in this light. Should we assume that the legend of this master Kong, Confucius, was built more or less at random in a sort of folklore, and I will come back to this word later on. In other words, was it formed more or less at random, erratically, during the centuries that took place between Confucius's lifetime, the 6th and 5th century before the Christian era, and the institution of the Han Empire in the 3rd and 2nd century before Jesus Christ? Should we also assume that this legend is engraved in marble, to use an image that's more Greco-Roman than Chinese? So this legend, is it therefore engraved in marble for the purposes of the empire during the 4 centuries that the Han dynasty lasted, let's say between 206 before the Christian era and 220 in our era? If, and I'm pushing my line of reasoning a bit further, if this hypothesis is founded in any manner, the text of the Luyu itself, the Analects, could very well be a collection of quotations, or what one could refer to as selected works, taken from a vast body of literature, very varied literature, from the multiplicity of masterminds in the pre-imperial ancient times, and also taken from what I referred to as folklore earlier, without us being able to identify with any degree of precision which quotations or selected works can truly be attributed more specifically to Master Kong. We have seen before that the texts in ancient pre-imperial times are still extremely fluid textual products, in that we saw that they were built with building blocks, as our American colleagues would say. In other words, cubes used for construction and very, very mobile. These cubes taking on the form of strips of bamboo that may be laid out or laid out again and again at will. I'm insisting a bit on this notion of folklore. Let me remind you that this word comes from the English language with the word folk inside. Folk, we find that in German, with the famous folk, which you find in Volkswagen, the people's car in Germany. So folk refers to people, combined with the word lore, Lore, which refers to a set of traditional knowledge or tales transmitted from one generation to the next. Of course, lore, we can see what the elders could pass on to the younger ones sitting by the fireside during long winter nights. So it's a body that is conveyed by means that are not necessarily laid down in writing. Folklore may be songs, dances, sayings, puzzles, anecdotes, little stories of all sorts, or funny stories. That's all a part of folklore. Why am I emphasizing this? As we saw several years ago, in the second part of the cycle on Confucius Revisited, that was in 2009, 2010, if I'm not mistaken, we kept the image of a Confucius who comes to us primarily from how Confucius was presented to the first Christian missionaries present in China as of the 16th century, but especially in the 17th and 18th century. And first and foremost, we had the Jesuit missionaries who decided to present to the European elites in the 17th and 18th century, in other words, the European elite during the Enlightenment period. So they therefore presented Confucius as Senarum Philosophus. In other words, Confucius was the Chinese philosopher. Some of you may recall this, but I'm just reminding you of the title of a monumental work compiled by a group of Jesuits and published at the end of the 17th century under the patronage of Louis XIV. In this monumental work, we find a significant amount of translations from the Confucian canonical corpus. And I find this quite symptomatic to note that the Confucius by the Jesuits is first and foremost a Confucius Philosophus, meaning Confucius philosopher. Not just a philosopher, but also presented to the elite in Europe like philosophers in the Greco-Latin period, primarily Greek, especially the Stoics. Stoic philosophers whose philosophy was part and parcel of the intellectual culture of the Jesuits. So they thought that they could find in Confucius yet another Stoic philosopher. And therefore, Confucius was presented as a thinker who had produced a doctrinal content that was said to have been laid down in a book referred to as the Luyu, meaning the Analects. And yet, we have started to note since last year that a lot of modern studies conducted by our colleagues, sinologists around the world, have been studying precisely to reach out to understand this image of Confucius statuified as an old wise man who was quite venerable and pontificating as presented through these scholarly images, canonical and exegetic, the objective being to resurrect Confucius, who would be more original. In other words, bringing out the more popular origins than one might believe as regards his legend. I announced certain analogies with the image of the Christ. But if we were to speak about the popular folklore that was formed since the pre-imperial ancient times around the figure of Confucius, of course, one could view Confucius as a sort of Robin Hood. It's quite easy to make that step. But that is one dimension that you should not overlook. You should clearly understand that the Confucius as philosopher is not only a very late construction, but it is also a construction that comes primarily from Europe. In fact, if you wanted to raise Confucius from the dead, I think we would need to turn towards legend. To come back to this first tale referred to as a biographical tale that we find in the historical records drafted by Sima Cheng dating back to the Han period. This tale begins with what we would call in our Republican institutions a birth registration card with the name, birthplace, and genealogy. If you were to look at the very beginning of the Shiji at chapter 47, you would learn that Kongzi, in other words, Master Kong, was born at a place known as To, which is a part of the district of Champin in the land of Lo. The fourth character on this slide. And we saw before, let me try to find the map somewhere, located therefore in the current province of Shandong. So here you have the land of Lo. And you would also discover that the ancestor of Master Kong came from a neighboring country, Song. Song has nothing to do with the subsequent Song dynasty. His ancestor's name was Kong Fangshu. This ancestor, and here you can see a sort of genealogy as what you could find in biblical traditions. This ancestor engendered a certain Portia, and this Portia engendered the father of our Confucius, whose name was Shulang-he. So this person, and here you have a phrase that should intrigue us a lot. They tell us that the Shulang-he was Ye-he. In others, if I were to translate this very literally, this would mean he formed an illicit union with a girl from the Yen family, and this is how we engendered Master Kong. So this tale, it begins nice and easily, like a birth registration card that seems to be pretty well formatted. But from the very first sentences, we have this story about Ye He, meaning a wild or illicit union, if we were to translate it very literally. Well, here's my page of characters. As you may imagine, it was extremely embarrassing for commentators who could not decently, literally translate it or understand it very literally, or even contemplate the idea that Confucius was born of a union that was not licit. And therefore, our national Chavan gives a translation where he works around it, oddly enough. Xin Yanhe, the Confucius' father, he tells us, formed a disproportionate union with a girl from the Yen family. Chavan tells us in his notes that this expression, where he works around it, is supposed to mean that, and here I believe that Chavan is largely based on Chinese canonical exegesis, is supposed to mean, therefore, that there was a great difference in age between Confucius's father, who at the time of this union was a man who was advanced in years. Some commentators speak about a man who was over 60 and a very young girl who was barely pubescent. So that is what this expression Ye He means, a wild or illicit union. You think of it what you will. I leave that up to you. So let me continue with the text we find in chapter 47 of the CG, where they tell us that his mother, we imagine that it is his mother, prayed. She sent out prayers on the Ni Cheng, in other words, on the Ni Hill. So this Ni Cho is in actual fact what is called today Ni Shan. In other words, the Ni mountain or hill. And this is where it was decided to locate the master's grotto, the Funzudong, which we saw before, a sort of hole that was probably dug out with pickaxes or explosives, I don't know, in this hill, and it was decided that this is where we would find the crib or the manger of young Confucius. It is therefore after these prayers on the hill Ni that this young girl conceived Master Kong. So we'll be coming back to this story about Cho, because then they tell us that Master Kong was born in the 22nd year, very well situated in time when I tell you that the Chinese are truly obsessed with historical references. Master Kong was born in the 22nd year of the reign of Duke Shang in the land of Luo. And that would mean year 551 before the Christian era. And they tell us, and this is where things once again go astray towards this supernatural. Upon his birth, on his skull, you could see a big bump, a sort of protuberance. And this is why, from this protuberance, on his skull, they arrived at his personal name, the Ni, meaning the name that the child receives at birth. So they gave him Ming, they gave him Cho as his personal name, Ming, Cho meaning mound, by reference precisely to the place of birth, the Nietzsche, meaning the Ni hill. And it was also because of this place of birth that they arrived at his name, Zi, which is Zhongni, literally meaning the youngest, the second son, therefore, Ni, and therefore it is this conglomerate of names all revolving around the theme of this small hill or little mountain. Just a brief reminder about the naming system in Chinese, because of course it only makes the reading more complicated for us as Europeans. In literature, be it historical, novels, and so on, not only must you try to remember Chinese names that are impossible to pronounce and very difficult, therefore, to memorize, but in addition, any Chinese of any worth has at least 3 or 4 different names. And naturally, in literature, a same character may appear under one of their 3, 4, or even 5 or 6 or more names. So you must know all the names of the same character, otherwise you will not be able to understand that they're referring to the same person. So first, of course, for a character you have the family name, which is Kong. That is what is pointed out in chapter 47 of the Shiji. So our Confucius' family name was Kong. He came from the Kong family. His ancestors bore the same name, as well as his descendants did. Upon his birth, they then gave him a Ming, meaning a personal name, and this is something that normally takes place when, symbolically speaking, the child begins to move on to become a teenager. In general, there is a ceremony where they receive the equivalent of a man's headdress for the Romans. And this is when they receive a zi, a name. And that gives us 3 names already. In addition, of course, if you are a writer or an artist, you also like to have a pen name or an artist's name that may be multiple. So the same character can be known under all these different names. So the story of his birth, we find it in the very first pages, plunging us immediately into geography. In other words, the life of an extraordinary being instead of a pure and simple biography. We saw that the mother conceived young Confucius after a lot of praying. Of course, we can't speak exactly about an immaculate conception, but after all, we're probably not very far from that. The conception is quite mysterious because the story in chapter 47 continues by noting that you have this very mysterious father, and you lose traces of him quite rapidly since we can't accurately locate his tomb. And given the ancestral practices in ancient China, that is really a problem, because if you cannot worship your father or pay tribute to your father because you do not know where your father's tomb is located, that is really a serious problem. Furthermore, the child bears physical marks, and through that we are supposed to imagine or recognize a suprahuman being, since he's born with this skull that looks like a hill or a mound. And this is associated to his personal name, Cho, and which we also find in the iconography subsequently. For example, here we find a portrait of Confucius at a very late period. It dates back to the 18th century. And in actual fact, this is the portrayal I chose for my own translation of the Analects of Confucius, where you may not see it clearly, but you have here an extremely tall forehead, a high forehead, with a protuberance which is extremely pronounced here. Another physical mark, a bit later on, in this same chapter 47 of the historical records, it is pointed out that Master Kong was 9 feet 6 inches tall, and they tell us his contemporaries, people all saw in him a true giant. And they found this being to be very strange. Some modern exegetes or commentators trying to find the equivalent of this 9 feet and 6 inches, and for them that would mean 2 meters 20. And therefore Li Ying, the historian from the Beijing University, whom I've spoken of on several occasions, Li Ying therefore says that Confucius was the same size as the star basketball player Yao Ming, one of the heroes at the Beijing Olympic Games and one of the few or the only Chinese to be playing in the American NBA, probably because of his size. Now, Yao Ming has now used his stardom to do a lot of advertising, so you can find him everywhere in television ads in China. So just imagine Confucius a bit looking like that. So here, that makes us think a bit about the fact that what we refer to as great men can also be just tall men. Of course, everyone is not Yao Ming or Confucius or General de Gaulle. But after all, being large, being tall can help to impose oneself. So these physical marks that were supernatural, for example, the fact of having several sets of eyes or ears that were normally long, all of these physical marks are supposed to be characteristic of most mythical sovereigns in Chinese in ancient China. Here we find Confucius with a protuberant skull, but here we find this portrayal of another wise man in ancient times, Shan Rong. In other words, the divine farmer. He is amongst the cultural heroes who were very mythical in ancient China, and they were supposed to have taught to human beings the art of tilling the land. And they taught human beings how to domesticate plants and so on. To a people of peasants, as was the case in China. So this divine farmer is really a founding figure. As you can see on this portrait, this divine farmer also has a skull with a very odd shape. He doesn't only have one bump, he has two. A sort of horn. And that reminds me of the title of the inaugural lesson given by my colleagues from the chair of Biblical Milieu, who entitled his inaugural lecture, Moise's Horns. So we can see that we do not have any exclusivity here as regards China. In this context, let us come back to the Han and the historical records. Assuredly, it was all about placing Master Kong in the lineage of these mythical sovereigns. You may note, by the way, that oddly enough, chapter 47 in the historical records devoted to the life of Confucius is entitled, and here is what you have at the bottom of this slide, Kongzi Xijia. In other words, if I were to translate it literally, the hereditary house of Master Kong. Whereas we should have expected to find this alleged biography precisely in the section of biographies, in other words, Lie Chuan. So in the historical records, you have a whole section where all the chapters are entitled Lie Chuan to this character, non-meaning biography of this character. Whereas here, this biography of Master Kong does not appear in this section of the biography, but in another section, where each chapter bears the words Xijia, meaning the hereditary house of this or that house or land. What's even more striking is, as regards the section on hereditary houses, the chapter devoted to Confucius is amongst the rare chapters devoted to an individual and not to a house or a family. It was supposed, and I think this hypothesis is quite plausible, that the reason for placing it like this in a section where you do not expect to find it is that at the time of Sima Qian, at the beginning of the Han, Confucius, or Master Kong, and his lineage were already worshipped officially. This is why his biography does not appear in the Lie Chuan section, but in the Xijia section. And one might say that everything contributes to making Confucius much more than an ordinary person, someone's already important, but who would just be entitled to a biography. Confucius is really taken as representing by himself a whole house, a whole filiation, lineage, an ascendance and descendants that is on an equal footing with a royal house in a way. On the other hand, and we'll come back to this, Confucius is presented as someone who is extraordinary, and as the Anglo-Saxons would say, larger than life. And therefore, he represents a royal person at the same time as a person who's almost deified, a divinity. And we find that already in all these details on his physical appearance. Rest reassured, I will not read with you the entire chapter 47, since you may read it yourselves on the internet. And as a matter of fact, it would certainly not be interesting for what we have to study here. But I will merely summarize very briefly what the Vulgate has retained from it, and that you find almost everywhere in almost any introduction to Confucius, including in mine here, as a matter of fact. So our Master Kong, as we know, came from the small principality of Lu, and we saw it in the map earlier, was surrounded on all sides by larger principalities and more powerful lands. Let me come back to the map. So here you have the Principality of Lu here, and you can see that all around it you have powers that are much greater geographically speaking. And this is apparently why our Confucius sought by every means to rise in services and to offer his advice, first in his birthland of Lu, where, according to the historical records, he was a minister, but the legend conveyed by the historical records claim that when he was around 50 years old, at the half of his lifetime, he left his birthplace, Lu, after realizing that his prince preferred the company of dancers to the much more austere task of dancing, or task of governing. So he banged the doors in a way, and he set out on a long period of wandering, roaming for several years with several companions through the principalities at the time to try to convince their prince to employ him, and therefore to take into account his wise advice on the art of governing. Unfortunately for him, he never managed to convince any sovereign or ruler at all for any significant period, and he finally returned old and tired, worn and disappointed to his birthplace, Lu, and according to chapter 47, he spends the rest of his days trying to transmit his vision of the world and of things, a bit by default, passing this on to the disciples who remained loyal to him. When you have failed your political career, you end up a teacher, right? Well, let's say that sometimes there are some careers that may be quite the opposite, with teachers who become ministers. But here, what do we have here? We have the general story of the career of what we would call today, familiarly, the career of a loser. But what I think chapter 47 is trying to convey to us is the career of a magnificent loser. In other words, and many specialists of the historical records, specialists of Sima Chen, and also of this chapter 47, thought they noted an analogy between the fate that the historical records attribute to Confucius, a career, first of all, with a rise in power, because Confucius was said to have moved to increasingly higher powers in government in his land of birth until he became Minister of Justice, they say. And then we had a sort of, how would I call this? A wandering, period of desperate wandering, roaming through the various principalities at the time. And here, the door is always slammed in his face, and he ultimately returns totally disappointed and worn out, and he then decides to pass on his teachings to his disciples. But bad luck for him, his favorite disciple, Yang Hui, whom we will find a bit later on, his favorite disciple dies prematurely. Of course, that leads him to ultimate despair, because this was the disciple on whom he relied the most to continue to pass on his teachings, and that disciple died before him. In the Shichi, they tell us about this rise followed by the decline of Confucius, and many have seen in this a parallel with the destiny of Sima Qian himself, because Sima Qian's destiny was quite legendary as well in Chinese collective memory. He also had prestigious forefathers. His father was an archivist at the Imperial Library, Sima Qian. So Sima Qian embarked on this effort to compile, following in the footsteps of his father's career. He was unfortunate, though, in that his employer got very angry at him. He was none other than Hao Di, the emperor, this warring, conquering emperor, a visionary and politician whom we spoke of at our last lecture. So, this emperor being angry at him, Sima Qian was subjected to one of the, how would I call this? One of the most cruel punishments before death. In other words, castration. Let me remind you that in ancient China, you had a criminal law that was based on a system of penalties, which consisted primarily in physical punishment. And as we can still see today, when we are shown what religious fanatics can do, which consists in cutting something off. They would start with the least cruel but infamous punishment, which would be a mark left on you as a criminal, a mark that was there for life. And next they would cut off your nose, and then they would cut off your one foot, and then another, and so on and so forth, until they reach castration as punishment. Castration doesn't help you physically in general, but more particularly, it is the fact that what's infamous about castration is that normally it prevents you from having any descendants. And of course, in China, especially at the time, this was something that was absolutely tragic. And of course, the last punishment would be decapitation. And this is why you don't need to go any further after that anyway. So what I find quite interesting for us, and I'll probably stop at this for today, is the fact of noting that in this chapter 47, we find a certain number of comments and fragments of dialogues that chapter 47 kept in the form of a dialogue that we also find in the Luyu, in the text of the Analects. For a long period, it was supposed that the historical records used these fragments of dialogue in the Analects to then put them in context along the lines of a continuous, consistent, chronologically ordered form of expression. But many researchers today are wondering whether or not we shouldn't reverse things. They started by wondering whether or not the historical records were the records quoting the Analects that were supposed to be before it. And they continued by wondering if they couldn't reverse this process, if the reverse process could not be just as plausible. According to some of these specialists, the Analects, the Luyu, could just as well have been compiled as a collection of selected works or selected comments put in the mouth of Master Kong when he started to be statuified, or he became sacred or deified under the Han, who clearly understood that a new centralized order needed not only a new form of management and governmental and administrative organization, but also a new order that we would describe today as ideological. I believe that this was truly at the basis of the power of this Han dynasty. In other words, by doubling the institution, the establishment of political institutions with an imperial ideology. I will stop here at this point for today, and we will resume our next lecture, where we will speak about the construction of the legend of Confucius through chapter 47 in the historical records, and also through the Analects, bringing these two texts together to compare, to see that here we can perceive parallels with the construction of the legend of the Christ in the gospel. Thank you for your attention, and see you next week.